just now, welcome everybody. If you are online, please give us a few minutes while we get ready. It is a hybrid event, so people are working from one location to the next. So if you can just stay online on mute, and we'll start in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Certain people then will just join us. And if
Do you
lots
have
of people
the
are
counter?
No. Okay. All right. Yeah, so everything's running. Just join us. So are we ready to start then? Yeah. And then Daphne is running late because it's delayed. So all right. Okay. So just let me just put the. Is it much or much? Okay. Oh, thank you. All right, so we'll start now then, and just to let you know that one of our speakers, Daphne, she's making her way from the blue zone here, and she has been delayed by protesters on the street. So hopefully she'll be able to make it on time, and she'll go last. So just please bear with us. So good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you are, welcome to this panel discussion on the law and policy dimensions of climate repair as part of the Climate Law and Governance Day 2021 at the University of Glasgow. Now, my name is Dr. Antonieta Nestor, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge and an associate fellow at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. And I'm also an engagement manager for the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge. So it is a pleasure and honor to be chairing this session among such distinguished panel. And just before we start, if you have your phone, please make sure it's mute. And for the people joining us online, please put your Q&A in the Q&A section. And the speakers will have about 8 minutes to present. And without further ado, I will start with, and I would like to welcome Dr. Sean Fitzgerald, and he's the director of the Center for Climate Repair, who will start with the opening remarks. So Sean, over to you.
Great. Well, a very good afternoon to everybody who's at least in the Glasgow time zone, and good morning, good evening, or whatever, depending on whereabouts in the world you happen to be. It's a very great pleasure to be able to open some remarks for this wonderful session. I just wanted to start by just giving a reflection on what we mean by climate repair. We're going to be talking about other aspects associated with that for the rest of the session. But by climate repair, well, first of all, the reason why we've come up with the term is that there is an understanding now that the state of the climate is something that is not tenable. We need to do something about it and actually improve our lot. So it's not just a case of trying to stop it getting worse, but actually what we need to do in order to improve the state of the climate. And the three-pronged attack that we need to have in our strategy for repairing the climate is as follows. The first one, which is going to be the mainstay of most of the 2 weeks of COP, for example, is reducing emissions. It's blindingly obvious that we have just been continuing to emit greenhouse gases from our own activities, as well as now increasing amounts from natural ones as well, which are causing basically huge amounts of problems with the atmosphere, and therefore the radiative forcing imbalance that we're experiencing. So we need to reduce emissions, and there's lots of activities being discussed about that. However, that will not on its own be sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. And therefore, because of the state, for example, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere right now being something like 500 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent, we are going to need to drain the atmosphere of at least some of those greenhouse gases. And in fact, the longer it takes us to reduce emissions to what is a sensible level, then I'm afraid we're going to have even more of the bathtub to drain. So emissions reduction is like turning off the taps. Greenhouse gas removal is a bit like trying to drain the bathtub. And we are going to need to do that in anger. We're going to be discussing that for the rest of this afternoon in the term negative emissions technologies. I actually prefer the term negative emissions approaches, because actually some of these approaches may be less technological, but nevertheless, I think we're going to be seeing and discussing a broad range of approaches. And the last approach that we think we have to worry about is the timescales for reducing emissions taking too long, the timescales for even scaling up greenhouse gas removal approaches taking too long. We're going to start losing some very precious parts of our ecosystems and causing untoward damage to all parts of the world. And therefore, what else can we do? Well, one of the big ideas is to try and therefore affect the radiation balance by looking at, for example, reflecting more of the sun. At the moment, our view is that it needs to be at a research stage rather than even stepping forward and saying we can do it, because we don't know whether we can do it, because we don't know enough about those approaches, and in particular we don't know enough about the unintended consequences and the governance issues and the controls of those. But nevertheless, there is a research need on all of those aspects that I've just laid out. That's the view of the Centre for Climate Repair. So the last bit, repair or refreezing of the Arctic, and that's how we consider all of these three areas in terms of climate repair. Antoinette, that's all I wanted to share. Over to you.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Sean, for such wonderful start. And now it is a pleasure to invite Dr. Jesse Reynolds. Now, Jesse Reynolds is an expert in international environmental policy. He researches and advises on how norms, rules, procedures, and institutions can help manage environmental opportunities and challenges, particularly those involving emerging technologies. In this, he draws from international environmental law, international relations, and economics. Now, Jesse, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours now.
Great. Thanks for having me virtually there at COP26 in Glasgow. I'm going to take the liberty, perhaps, to slightly push the boundary of the scope of this conversation. I hope I don't push that boundary too far. I see policy, the outcome of policy, as something of the intersection of law and politics. So I'm going to start with the politics side of that equation and spend a little bit more time on that, and then circle back around to law and explain why. From my view, negative emissions approaches or technologies, which are sometimes called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, out of habit. In my eyes, this has long been the dirty secret of international climate change policy. Let me explain why. As far back as 2007, in the lead up to the 5th assessment report, the IPCC leadership pushed that there would be top-level scenarios that would be likely to keep global warming within the 2-degree target that was emerging at that time as the agreed-upon target. And in response, climate modelers increased negative emissions in their models, the assumed negative emissions into the future, in the form specifically of bioenergy carbon capture and storage, a specific negative emission technology. They basically turned up that knob in their models to scales that I think many observers would call infeasible. Now, these modelers put disclaimers on their scientific paper, statements that said, look, this would create some economic and some social and political challenges, serious environmental risks. And those disclaimers were also in at least the third working group report of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. But that message was largely lost to the extent that negative emissions were discussed in subsequent years, this disclaimer. And instead, the conversation proceeded as if that scenario, the RCP 2.6, as it was called, was largely a matter of aggressive emissions reduction. But that wasn't the case. And nevertheless, the actual carbon removal aspect of this, the negative emissions, was something that wouldn't be discussed in polite company. A lot of people knew about it. A lot of informed observers in the climate change discourse knew about it, but it was the elephant in the room. And it was just kept quiet. Nevertheless, by 2015, the Paris Agreement quietly endorsed the use of negative emissions to achieve the warming target that's embodied there. It speaks of balancing anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases. And it calls on parties to take action to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. That's the language that the Paris Agreement uses, and similar in the UNFCCC, to refer to negative emissions, enhancement of sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. And it wasn't until around 2017, 2018, that this elephant in the room became widely acknowledged in the climate change discourse. It was more openly discussed. And just now, I would say in the last year and a half or so, the attention to carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions has ramped up toward a level commensurate with what it is assumed to be in some of the more optimistic models of the future. So on the one hand, better late is never, but on the other hand, this 10-year delay has a real impact on the type of, on our understanding of what negative emissions can do, how it would be governed, the social and political challenges, et cetera. I also said that law is a big part of policy. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, largely because there's other speakers here who will do so, who may be, in fact, better qualified to do so. I will briefly say that, as I mentioned, negative emissions are clearly within the scope of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, clearly endorsed by both of them. There are some issues to be addressed around permanence and monitoring and verification. And just this week, we're starting to see some of the language, just for the first time, to my knowledge, the first instance of a draft COP decision that specifically addresses carbon removal besides reforestation and deforestation. And this is in the Article 6 negotiations that are going on now. And other specific CDR techniques or negative emissions do raise some diverse legal issues, both domestically in terms of managing environmental risk and internationally managing things like the global commons, the high seas, and so forth. So I look back on this and I see that ultimately negative emissions policy is constrained more by the political dynamics than the legal dynamics. There's legal problems, but these can be overcome. It's an issue of politics. And I'll close by expressing my concern that the climate community is at risk of repeating this dynamic around the issue of what Sean mentioned, which is increasing climate repair by increasing the reflectivity of the Earth, so-called solar radiation modification, sometimes called solar geoengineering. And that's because in really the best case scenario, the best feasible case, at least in my eyes, is we're going to overshoot the 2-degree warming target and draw down in the latter half of the century through net negative emissions back below 2 degrees C toward 1.5, let's say around the year 2100. But in the meantime, we're going to have overshoot. Real climate risks, real climate impacts will be borne by the world's populations who are already the most vulnerable. So solar geoengineering or solar radiation modification appears uniquely positioned to be able to reduce those short-term climate risks during overshoot. Yet once again, it's something that's not discussed in polite company. And I would hope that dynamic can change sooner rather than later. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jesse, for your presentation. Now we move to Mr. Matthias Honegger, who is sitting here next to me. And Matthias, he's a senior consultant at Perspectives. He holds MSc in Environmental Sciences from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, in Switzerland. And he has visited Oxford University, Harvard, Yale, and the University of Heidelberg for short intensive courses and summer schools on various topics of international governance. Now, besides his work with Perspectives, he is pursuing a PhD with the group of Professor Frank Biermann at Utrecht University, and also works at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Boston. Correct. So, Matthias, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I will pick up where Jesse left off and speak a little bit about the governance and law dimensions on carbon removal that are currently sort of starting to take shape and are starting to be addressed in academic research, but also very gradually in negotiations. And the first one on the next slide is the recognition that mitigation of climate change is understood under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement really does include the removal of CO2 or any other greenhouse gases that are covered by the UNFCCC, not only so to be limited to the reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases, but really also the removal. And that also means on the next slide that governance principles that apply to the mitigation of climate change equally apply to carbon dioxide removal. And that's very important as a starting point to sort of gradually figuring out what contribution carbon removal could actually play. And the first one is very obviously the distributive aspect of the mitigation burden, which is addressed with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities. And that sort of suggests that, you know, the initial burden really lies with well-developed industrialized nations. It also means that these nations have to drive forward on the more costly approaches, and by doing so, actually drive down the costs for everyone. And that involves pilot activities as well as research and development funding. And furthermore, and I think this is not addressed at all so far, this could mean that technology transfer, financial support, climate finance, and capacity building support should become mobilized for nations that are struggling to keep up with mitigation in general, such that they also get access to the options that are posed by various removal technologies or practices, if you will. On ambition, there's this line in the Paris Agreement that says that emissions should peak as soon as possible. That could be read to mean that emissions reductions, first and foremost, need to take place, but it's also a very clear element of the Paris Agreement architecture that the highest possible ambition needs to be reflected in mitigation contributions, and that targets need to be comprehensive. That's already rooted in the convention. And so that means when we recognize removals as a form of mitigation, that removals need to be considered in the planning of mitigation contributions, both at a long-term perspective in the long-term low carbon development strategies with a perspective to 2050, as well as in the shorter term NDCs and the policy instruments that actually achieve those. Next slide, please. And all of this has to take place in the context of sustainable development, as is emphasized in the preambular language of the Paris Agreement, as well as parties need to consider, respect, promote, and consider the various rights that could be affected by mitigation efforts, including by carbon dioxide removal, where the discussion at the moment is very strong in terms of possible land use effects that could arise if biomass-based mitigation efforts, including to achieve removals, are actually pursued at large scale. So bioenergy and CCS being the focal aspect there. And in a so all of this is kind of covered in one paper that I think I linked, or I included the reference to. And in another paper, we looked at what the literature currently says in terms of the concerns and needs for governance to meet such that removals play a constructive role. And those 6 are listed on that slide. I won't read them out loud. I think it's in all our interest to move forward. One particular aspect I'd like to get more into very little bit, and just to know that all of these points are actually basically starting points. I think on all of these, we could write a couple of papers. If you're interested, please join me. The rough infrastructure for the MRV of carbon removals is there in principle, but, and it's a big but, they have not been conceived with removals in mind for the largest part. And so changes are needed, adaptations are needed, such that these instruments to monitor, report, and verify the mitigation results that are achieved through activities are actually credible. And so we need a lot of work to make that happen. There's still a lot of definitional ambiguities and misunderstandings around all those terms: carbon capture and storage, CCU, carbon capture and use, carbon capture use and or storage. You see all variants of these terms, and we need to be a lot more consistent, and we need guidance. And on the next slide, I point to the possibilities for such guidance coming from the IPCC inventory reporting guidelines, which could take this as homework, but also, as Jesse pointed out, under Article 6 negotiations, these need to be addressed more consistently. Right now, the text has several flaws in that regard. And finally, we need, and we, meaning here really industrialized nations, need to go forward with credible, robustly planned, and transparently and participatorily planned removal pilot activities, and sort of take the gradual steps towards scaling up, because if we don't see that happen in the real world, we will miss a lot of the challenges that are there in all of those regards, making this happen in a credible and real way. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah, there's just a couple of references.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And I might actually take you up on that MRV co-authoring paper after the chat later on. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Spodansky. Dan is a Regents Professor of Law in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And he's also an affiliate faculty member with the Center of Law, Science and Innovation and the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability School of Sustainability at and also he is the leading authority on international environmental law generally and global climate change law in particular. He teaches courses in public international law and sustainability, and he's a key player in his college program on law and sustainability. So Dan, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you. And Dan, you're muted.
Thanks very much, and good morning. I'm in Phoenix, so it's about 6:50 here in the morning. So it's a pleasure to be here. I just really wanted to pick up on some of the points that have already been made and to highlight them. I really have three main points. So next slide, please. So the first is that NETs encompass a wide variety of technologies. So we're talking about a huge range of technologies or approaches, as Sean preferred to put it, including highly technological ones like direct air capture, but then also things like ocean fertilization, afforestation, reforestation, and so forth. And what I'm going to be saying applies to all of this wide variety of approaches or technologies. Next slide, please. So as Jesse said, the dirty secret that's now less of a secret is that NETs will be negative emission approaches or technologies will be essential to achieving the Paris temperature goals. So there's really, I think, very little prospect of achieving even the 2-degree goal, let alone the 1.5 degree without the use of negative emissions. Next slide, please. And then the third point, which is really the key point, is that despite this, despite the importance of negative emission technologies, very little work has been done thus far on how to incorporate them into the Paris Agreement framework. So the Paris Agreement establishes the basic framework for approaching dealing with the climate change issue internationally. NETs are going to be an important element of that. And yet, thus far, there's been very little work by negotiators, by countries to incorporate NETs into the Paris Agreement framework. Next slide, please. So let me say 4 things about the Paris Agreement and NETs in general. So the first is a point that both Jesse made and Matthias already made. NETs are a type of mitigation. The UN Framework Convention, the UN climate change regime, from the very start took what was called a comprehensive approach that looked not only at emissions and reducing emissions, but also at removals, increasing removals from the atmosphere. So the Paris Agreement rules on mitigation all apply to NETs, as Matthias was pointing out in his presentation just now. A second point is that NETs, therefore, can be included in nationally determined contributions. So nationally determined contributions can include the use of NETs under them. And that includes, I think, and this is a point that I don't think is well appreciated, including NETs outside one's territory. There's nothing in the Paris Agreement that requires that an NET be done within your own territory. So for example, ocean fertilization on the high seas, if that becomes feasible and safe and a means of reducing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, those potentially could be included by a country within its nationally determined contribution. A third point is that the Paris Rulebook generally doesn't address NETs, with the exception of land use change and forestry. It wasn't designed with NETs in mind, so it doesn't deal with a lot of issues, which I'll come back to in a minute, relating to NETs. The fourth point, I think, which is the key one, really, is that multilaterally agreed harmonized rules, like the rules that were adopted in Katowice, the so-called Paris Rulebook, multilaterally agreed rules addressing NETs aren't a precondition for countries to use NETs. Countries can go ahead and use NETs even in the absence of multilaterally agreed rules, but it would be desirable to develop such rules. In the absence of any agreement on rules dealing with NETs, countries will need to nationally determine, in essence, how to satisfy the Paris Agreement requirements. For example, the requirement to provide the information necessary for clarity, transparency, understanding, the need to do accounting, the need to satisfy the requirements of Article 6, in particular, the prohibition on double counting, how to incorporate NETs into the enhanced transparency framework. The way the Paris Agreement works is that it establishes some broad requirements, but then provides for the development of rules, elaborating those requirements. But in the absence of multilaterally agreed rules, countries can still go ahead and do things. They just have to figure out how to satisfy the Paris Agreement requirements on their own. The development of multilaterally agreed rules has been generally seen as desirable. That's the function of the Katowice rulebook, Paris rulebook. So developing multilaterally agreed rules on NETs, I think would be desirable as a way of avoiding differing and potentially conflicting interpretations as to how to fit NETs under the Paris framework. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, just to raise a few issues that would be desirable to address in the rulebook. And as I understand it, this is beginning to be done now in Article 6, and I think Natalie will be talking more about that in a minute. But do the references in the Paris Agreement to, quote, emissions also encompass removal? So when the Paris Agreement has a provision dealing with emissions, does that provision potentially also apply to NETs? For example, the Article 6.4 mechanism, would that encompass NETs, even though it refers to a mechanism about reducing emissions? Second question, does the term removal require durable storage? And if so, how long constitutes durable? So how long would greenhouse gases that are removed from the atmosphere need to be stored in order to be countable or accountable? Where does removal take place? Third question, where the greenhouse gases are captured or where they're stored. And this is particularly important under Article 6, where potentially greenhouse gases might be captured in one country, but then ultimately transported and stored in a different country. So which country gets to account for those removals? The country where they're captured, where the uptake takes place from the atmosphere, or where they're stored. A fourth is inventory methodologies for NETs. The IPCC has developed inventory methodologies for many things, but they're not any inventory methodologies for all of the different NETs that are potentially might be used by states. So that's, I think, a task that the IPCC needs to really get onto, is developing inventory methodologies for the different NETs that are being discussed. And then finally, important question, how to account for leakage, the non-permanence. What happens if greenhouse gas that's been removed and is being stored escapes from the storage and re-enters the atmosphere? How will that be accounted? Who will be responsible for that? The country that captured the emissions initially, the country that's storing the emissions, and so forth. So these are just some of the issues, I think, that would be desirable to begin to, for countries to begin discussing, for countries to try to develop multilaterally agreed answers to these questions. So I think it's high time for countries to really recognize the role that NETs are going to need to play in achieving the Paris Agreement goals and developing multilateral rules to address them. Thanks.
And indeed, concepts and questions that need to be answered and developed. That is a lot of work that needs to be done still. Now, if you're joining us online, please remember to put your Q&A in the Q&A section. Now, our next speaker is Ms. Daphne Wissam. Daphne is the CEO of Methane Action, and for 20 years, Daphne was a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she founded and directed the Climate Justice Program and served on the Executive Committee of the Board of Directors. Her team's groundbreaking research drew attention to the disproportionate ratio of fossil fuels investments by international financial institutions, the World Bank in particular, and resulted in world leaders, including former Vice President Al Gore and members of the US House and Senate, calling for reforms. So Daphne, thank you very much. You were in the blue zone and you really have to rush here. Thank you very much.
My apologies for being a little bit late. Yes, and in fact, we have some great news to announce here at the COP that 19 countries, is it 19, and have agreed to fully phase out all public finance for fossil fuels, which is something that we were calling for way back in 1997. So that is a huge achievement, and it's due to social movements and people putting pressure on their governments. So that's a bit of good news. So I'm going to start with some bad news, and then I'm going to get back to the good news. The bad news is that methane levels are rising very rapidly. They're rising far more rapidly than carbon dioxide. And if we were to include methane in the greenhouse gas global warming potential, right now we think of only CO2 at about 420 parts per million, we would be closer to 500 parts per million. Methane is roughly 84 times more potent than CO2. Instantaneously, it's over 100 times more potent than CO2. And right now, it is coming from both man-made sources and natural sources. And that's the big concern, is that, of course, we know about the methane pledge that came out of just the last few days here in Glasgow, where world leaders, over 100 countries, agreed to cut their methane emissions by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And that's a good first step, but it's nowhere near far enough to get to avoiding the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures. The UN says we need to cut by at least 45% by 2030 to avoid exceeding the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature. So what my group is doing at Methane Action is taking a close look at the scary science about methane being released from permafrost as the permafrost is melting, particularly in the East Siberian Arctic shelf. Subsea permafrost is melting and thawing, and methane is bubbling up. Some scientists suggest there is a likelihood of a so-called methane burst sometime this decade, which would be, of course, cataclysmic. Others say the chance is slim that it would all come out at once. It may come out over a century or over 1,000 years. But regardless, methane is now coming up in the Arctic. It's also emerging from wetlands in tropical regions at an accelerated rate. So what we're seeing is warming is accelerating warming, and methane is potentially spinning out of control. Well, here's the good news. For the first time in September, the IPCC recognized that methane removal is possible. And in fact, some of the scientists that I'm working with were cited in that IPCC report. Stanford professor Rob Jackson, who serves on our board, Renaud de Richter, who is one of our science advisors, were the two scientists that were referenced in this IPCC report. Our goal at Methane Action is to cut atmospheric methane emissions in half, not anthropogenic, atmospheric in half this decade. And we are excited to say that that may be possible. But right now there's so little awareness of the potential of methane removal that there's no law around it. There's no funding around methane removal. So our first step is just to get the word out. So we are getting the word out. We were in the Washington Post yesterday. We've been in Science Magazine a couple days ago. We've been in The Hill. We're finally getting the word out. In terms of the law around negative emissions technology as it relates to methane removal, of course, there is the Paris Agreement, and that's been covered by some of the previous speakers, so I won't go into detail on that. Of course, the Paris Agreement not only encourages negative emissions technologies to meet nationally determined contributions, but one could go even further and say that under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is another a way in which we could pursue our legal framework for methane removal. There is under Article 3, it repeats in black letter law the customary duty of a party not to allow entities under its jurisdiction or control to harm the environment of another party. And it requires parties under Article 8 to halt or control actions degrading biological diversity or ecosystems. And of course, methane, like CO2, is greatly degrading biological diversity and ecosystems. Article 8 suggests the need to rehabilitate and restore degraded ecosystems and promote the recovery of threatened species. So we see great potential in not just the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but also in the Convention on Biological Diversity. Another treaty that could be utilized to address methane removal is the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution and the protocols on ground level ozone, nitrous oxide, and black carbon. And then finally, the London Protocol and Convention, given the fact that greenhouse gas emissions and black soot could be considered dumped in the ocean, in the sense that a lot of CO2 is taken up by the ocean. But I want to get back to the more hopeful message, which is climate restoration. One of the things that Rob Jackson has been writing about at Stanford is you know, that we are now in the decade of ecosystem restoration, UN decade of ecosystem restoration. And we should be thinking of the atmosphere as an ecosystem. And there are sinks and sources in the atmosphere for methane. There's the hydroxyl radical and the chlorine radical, which are both sinks. How do we enhance those atmospheric sinks? That's what our scientists are working on right now. And they're doing so by mimicking a natural process. I'll just give you one example because I've only got about a minute left. The Sahara dust, it's iron-rich, red dust. When it blows out over the Atlantic Ocean, it mixes with the salt sea spray and the chlorine that's given off by the salt sea spray and UV light and the sunshine, and that oxidizes methane. That's something that happens naturally. How can we mimic that? How can we observe it happening right now? In fact, in the plume of ships that just by coincidence are releasing iron in their bunker fuels. So the first step is to observe the methane oxidation in the ship plume, which is what our scientists are working on next. And then to begin to scale up the governance. And in fact, we do have a long list of wonderful signatories on our call for a methane declaration on a declaration on reducing atmospheric methane that includes Professor Michael Mann, Gus Speth, some of the leading legal minds who have worked in the White House and others are saying that now is the time for us to put in place the governance to make sure that this is not used as an opportunity for business as usual, but to begin to restore methane to pre-industrial levels and to use that as the beginning, as the leaping off point to not only meet our Paris targets, but to exceed them, we can potentially shave off 0.4 degrees Celsius using methane removal technologies, which could roll back climate forcing by 15 years or more. So that's what we're about at Methane Action, and I'm over time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Daphne. And we should say, well, now is the time. So it's be a new slogan to start. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce you now to Dr. Natalie Jones. Natalie is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and she's also a strategic advisor to the Center for Climate Repair. Her work is about who is involved in decision-making around the world's most pressing issues. She holds a PhD in international law and an LLM from the University of Cambridge, and a BSc in physics and an LLB from the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Natalie, it's a pleasure to have you. And are you ready? Yeah.
I think so. Should I unmute myself? I'm not quite sure how
well, okay.
I just need to. Okay, very good, very good. Okay. All right, I assume everyone can hear me and can see my slides, so I will start. Thanks for inviting me, and lovely to hear the previous presentations. A lot of very exciting work happening here. I am in the thick of the negotiations. I was running from the blue zone as well, and I am deep in the text on Article 6, which you can see right here. I feel like it's my life at the moment. So I'm going to take you in depth on what Article 6 says about carbon removal and GHG removal. And this is very much a state of play because the latest text came out in the early hours this morning, bangs on my eyes. And yeah, I'm going to show you some pieces of that text. So just as a fair warning, the following slides are going to be very text heavy. However, don't really worry about reading each and every word. I will guide you through it. So just as a brief introduction to Article 6, because everyone throws around this term Article 6, you know, what actually is it? So it sets up a couple of different ways that parties can basically exchange their carbon credits or their emissions credits. It is off the back of provisions like this in the Kyoto Protocol, but it establishes two different mechanisms. The first is what is called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, which is, you know, really catchy, obviously. This is essentially more of a bilateral thing. So if one country is overachieving on its NDC, it can sell a credit to a country that is underachieving and wants to purchase that other country's emissions reductions, and that's Article 6.2. There's also a mechanism under Article 6.4, which is sometimes referred to as the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is basically establish an international carbon market. And this is modelled kind of-ish off the clean development mechanism that existed under the KP, but a lot of countries are wanting rules that are more stringent than those under the Kyoto Protocol, because there were several issues with that, to say the least. So that's the broad outline, and removals aren't explicitly mentioned in Article 6. But then in alongside the Paris Agreement, we had this decision which was requesting one of the SBs, subsidiary bodies under the Univ CCC, to develop guidance, right, on like how these mechanisms would actually work and operationalize, because these paragraphs, as you saw, were really broad. And what you need when you have a carbon market is you need accounting rules, you need reporting rules, you need a lot of rules to make sure that it actually delivers ambition and actual emissions reductions and everything like that. So what we're doing now, well, in fact, what Party's have been doing for the last 6 years, this work was originally meant to be concluded in 2018 in Katowice, then it was pushed down to Madrid, and then Party still couldn't agree there. So it's happening now, but what I've been hearing in the room, because I've been in the Article 6 rooms over the past few days, I've been hearing a lot of enthusiasm for winding this work up in Glasgow. So we can wait and see, but basically, yeah, like everything I'm about to say is like, let's wait and see what actually happens. This is what is in the text at the moment, but we'll see at the end of next week what indeed happens. And there's no guarantees about anything. So, okay. So now I'm just a bit confused. Okay, yeah, that's still part of this. Yeah, because I know what the state of play. So this is in the text on ITMOs. There's a paragraph here on requesting, again, a subsidiary body to undertake work until the end of next year. So this is work that would happen until the end of next year, on like specifically on what's called anthropogenic removal enhancements. So how to address the issue of leakage in particular, reversals, and these kind of accounting rules. So this is really timely, because as Dan was just saying, there is the need for these rules, and there is scope for these rules to actually be agreed in the following year. So this is a really important time for work on this. And you see there's also some text there about avoidance of other negative environmental and social impacts. We also have, again, under ITMOs, we have a definition in the text that includes removals, and you will see this is in paragraph 1B, emissions reductions and removals, and this is not in brackets. And as far as I have heard in the rooms, this is not disputed. So if there is agreement, all the disputes on like other, there are a lot of big issues under dispute, but none of them, as far as I'm aware, involve removals. So for a lot of people in this room, that might be very welcome. And then one of the key issues under Article 6.2 is double counting. So this is the issue if you're one country and you're selling and another country is buying, how to make sure that both those countries are not counting those emissions reductions when they're reporting on their inventories. Because if you double count, it's bad, because it means you're counting emissions reductions or removals that aren't actually there. But in the paragraphs on how to avoid this double counting, we have this idea which is called corresponding adjustments, which is basically you have, yeah, anyway, like I won't get into it. It's not necessary for the purposes of this talk. But we do have removals, which is highlighted specifically in there as well. This is in a bracketed paragraph. The one at the bottom is in brackets, not because of the removal thing, but just because there's an issue about like quantification, which is different. But removals are in both of these paragraphs around how corresponding adjustments will apply. So that's really good news. And then we have removals also included. There's another dispute around like if those can only be within your NDC or if it can also be outside of your NDC, but we have removals under both those paragraphs, so it's not really an issue. And then briefly in my remaining time, oh yeah, there's also some reporting requirements which I won't go into, but there are reporting requirements in the language under this, and again, these are not disputed as far as I'm aware. This is all again reporting requirements, just a lot of text. Okay, so briefly in my remaining time, I'll talk about the Article 6.4 mechanism. Recall that this is the replacement of the clean development mechanism. Paragraph 6C. So this requested body, which is going to govern the mechanism, is requesting the body to develop further recommendations, again, on this issue of leakage, reversals, and everything like that under removal. So that's potentially really positive work again. And then here is the definitional thing again. So for a project or a program or any other type of activity that is included under this mechanism, it includes both emissions reduction and again, removals. And as far as I'm aware, this is again not disputed, and removals are treated exactly the same, and all the same rules apply with removals just as they would with reducing emissions. And then there's a also in this paragraph, you have to minimize the risk of leakage and adjust for any remaining leakage in the calculation of emissions reduction or removals. And then there are a bunch of more technical rules and kind of explanations and information that the party has to provide. But so yeah, and there's so that's an issue that I won't go into because there's not much time. But basically, there is an issue about if credits from the clean development mechanism can transfer over into the new mechanism. This is very controversial and a matter of debate, but and the text on all of that is in brackets. But if it does happen, then there will be removals provided for in there as well. So in conclusion, if these rules are agreed here in Glasgow, which again is not a guarantee, and if these paragraphs remain the same as they are now, as of about 4 o'clock this morning, then yes, greenhouse gas removal is included in the Article 6 rulebook, which I think is positive news, and all the obligations will apply just as they would for emissions reduction, including reporting, corresponding adjustments, but with all the caveat that this could change, so take this as a state of play, and yeah, let's maybe write a paper on this in the future.
The paper is getting bigger and bigger, so thank you very much, Natalie. Now, last but not least, I have Dr. Holly Jean Buck. She is online. That's wonderful. And Holly, she's an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Buffalo in New York. She researches how communities can be involved in the design of emerging environmental technologies. And she works at the interface of sociology, geography, and science and technology studies. So Holly, thank you very much for joining us today. It's still morning time there, I believe. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic panel that has covered quite a lot of ground, so I'm going to be very brief. Thinking at a high level, what are the governance challenges with carbon removal and our existing frameworks dealing with them? To me, it seems that generally existing policy framework seems slow to incorporate this, referencing Jesse's presentation about how, this has been in the back of our awareness in the modeling and so forth for a long time. And that slowness may be a problem because other actors aren't waiting. So in terms of what the challenges are, we've heard a lot about them. Some of these are sort of being addressed, dealing with permanence for land and ocean-based removals, technology transfer and support for the Global South. Matthias touched on this. Ensuring co-benefits. There's a lot of talk about co-benefits and, voluntary carbon market schemes try to kind of nod to those. But speaking as a social scientist that I have a lot of colleagues who are working in geography or anthropology on the ground, doing ethnographic work in some of these places where forest carbon schemes have been set up, talking to farmers about adoption. Those co-benefits aren't always, guaranteed. So there's more work to be done there, especially with regards to MRV, the monitoring, reporting, verification that we've heard about. How do you incorporate the co-benefits into that? Obviously, there's really big technical challenges with the MRV around things. Some of them can't just be kind of explained away with, new machine learning approaches. And the monitoring is expensive, right? And then there's MRV challenges, not just on the technical side, but on the social side in terms of how do you do any of this in places with weak governance? I think we've learned a lot from the forest carbon examples about the challenges there. And so the European Union has specifically said that it wouldn't count outside carbon credits toward its net zero goal. That may be one way of solving it, but then also limiting some of the flexibility with these things. So that's all stuff that's kind of been talked about, that's on people's radar, right? And I wanted to mention something else that gets less attention, which is the issue of residual emissions. So everybody says that carbon removal should be used to compensate for residual emissions from hard to abate sectors, but there's no totally agreed upon norm or anything more specific than a norm about what are these hard to abate sectors or activities. I think this changes over time as other technologies mature. We have more options for decarbonizing industry than we might have thought about 10 years ago. Maybe the same will be, it'll be the same for aviation. I don't know, kind of a lot depends on innovation. But the main point is that we don't have a mechanism for making sure that carbon removals are in fact compensating for emissions from hard to abate sectors. This seems to be just like a big thing that isn't even being talked about much. Another thing I wanted to raise is just kind of this sense in the tech community and in the activist community. There's kind of a funny overlap here that carbon markets 1.0 were fundamentally flawed, like haven't delivered. Problems with fraud, the double counting problem, which negotiators are working on, as we just heard about. Additionality, kind of like a big flaw in all of it because it's hard to prove. And so removals is a way you get away from some of these concerns. I think that we might be moving towards this kind of carbon 2.0 that has three characteristics. One is that it favors removals. We've seen some early adopters in this space saying we don't want to deal with offsets anymore. We want to really focus on removals. I think the second characteristic is that it involves decentralized finance to some degree, which is, according to some people, the future of finance more generally. So you've got a digital representation of that ton of carbon that's traded or held or tracked on the blockchain. So then the question is, if a tree falls in the real world, is that fall heard in the metaverse? I mean, people are working out how all this might work. And, I feel like a lot of people that are in carbon 1.0 are kind of trying to catch up with some of the movement in the private sector and in the tech space. The third characteristic of kind of this carbon 2.0 is that it would be set up to finance future removals. So we see Vera, for example, working on a projected carbon unit that would provide proponents of registered projects with instruments that could be transacted at this early stage of the project cycle, which they say could be relevant to nature-based carbon removal projects that take a long time to get off the ground. Some of these arrangements would also be good for financing industrial carbon removal projects. And so they're seeing these kind of new instruments as ways to build market liquidity, facilitate transactions. Of course, then you probably get speculation. I'm not saying that carbon 2.0 would be a good system. It might end up terribly, but it's moving ahead because the private sector is taking action since governments have been so slow to do anything on climate change. And so maybe people who work in carbon 1.0 will be playing catch up. Because I think what we've got now is, governments haven't done enough. So these platforms are performing a sort of de facto governance. And I think there's risks there in terms of ending up with something that works, that everybody trusts. But I think that those of us who care about this stuff should have it on our radar. And I'll leave off there, looking forward to our discussion.
Aspects, sort of, we have the policy, the legal, the sociological, the financial aspects, without taking into account all the science involved. So it's an area that is growing, and it requires a lot of attention still as well. So we're just moving to the Q&A. Would anybody on the audience have any questions for any of the panelists? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so hi, I work for Friends of the Earth Netherlands on the climate case against Shell. And, you know, when we're talking about negative emission technologies, it's often hijacked by big corporates. And you know, a company like Shell saying they want to plant a forest 3 times the size of Brazil. And I feel that's sort of polluting the discussion almost a little bit. So do you have any ideas on how we can deal with those sort of fairy tale promises of big corporates in this whole discussion?
Were the panelists online, were you able to hear the question? Yes? Okay. All right. So who would like to go answer first? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. One of the reasons why we are focused on governance around methane removal is to avoid that exact outcome. In fact, my personal feeling, and it's we have yet to take a formal position as an organization, is that methane removal should be adopted on an emergency basis and funded by governments, and not be part of carbon markets at all, especially given the potential for a major burst from the Arctic. The last thing you would want to do is call that an offset that would somehow be allowed elsewhere. So, but yeah, governance is key. We're looking to the Arctic Council as a way of engaging some of the largest methane emitters, Russia and the US, as well as indigenous peoples, and making sure that their rights and engagement are protected.
Matthias, you want to answer that?
Yes, I'd love to. I think it's an absolutely excellent question and really at the crux of where we're at right now. My experience has been that a lot of the problems that have occurred in the past in carbon markets, in empty promises, were, if you dug down, you could actually find them to be not out of malice in some cases, but out of sheer incompetence or lack of capacity. Perhaps sometimes it is malice further up in hierarchies, but there's a lot that can be done to use the tools that we have right now and make them work in the way intended. And we're, with Perspectives, we are engaged heavily in the CCS Plus initiative, which tries to do that by involving all the actors in this space and pushing hard for environmental integrity in doing so.
Excellent. Yeah, Natalie?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I love your work, so well done. One proposal I find quite interesting is the idea by, I think, Kate Aronoff and others around nationalizing oil companies and turning them into carbon removal companies, and that would remove kind of one of these perverse incentives, although of course you know, there are potentially a lot of other issues with how that would work and how that would be kind of controlled in a democratic way, but I think there might be an idea worth keeping an eye on.
Thank you. And now go to the our online panelist. Jesse, would you? Okay.
Well, if I'm being called upon, I am concerned about empty promises. And I'm concerned that current decisions regarding emissions cuts and climate change responses more generally hinge upon assumptions about a wide range of developments in the future that may or may not happen. This isn't limited to carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions technologies. It includes the degree to which renewable energy can scale up, the degree to which energy storage is possible to smooth out the renewable energy sources that are not continuous, the degree to which behavioral changes are likely to occur. I do believe that a wide range of actors in the climate change discourse sometimes rely upon such assumptions, and it's not limited to corporations. My personal interest in climate change is to transition to a world in which climate change doesn't pose risks to the vulnerable people. I don't have a particular bone to pick if corporations and individuals make a profit in the process.
Thank you. Now, Dan or Holly, would you like to answer that question as well? So, Dan?
Well, thanks. Well, I was going to make the same point that Jesse just made, so I really don't have anything to add. I think there are a lot of promises. There are a lot of things about what's going to be done in 2050, 2060, 2070, and whether those are credible or not is a question. So I think this isn't really limited to things that are said about carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removals. It applies across the board. That's why, I think actually what's most meaningful is what countries are saying they're going to do in their NDCs, because that they are supposed to be quantifying in a clear, transparent, understandable way with monitoring, verification afterwards, review. So I guess those are the ones that I think are hopefully the most credible. And then with respect to all of the other promises that are made, including a lot of the stuff being said now in Glasgow, that's important. It sends signals, hopefully those promises will be fulfilled. But I think, with all of them is open question. So I wouldn't limit this just to a question about the problem with removals.
Thank you, Dan. And Holly, anything else to add?
Yeah, so I think the one challenge is that the net zero and focusing on emissions after combustion, we lose sight of the challenge of production. Climate policy hasn't really focused on the phase out of fossil fuels. And as Natalie mentioned, I think one way we could go forward is to link carbon removal with phase out by using current oil companies to transform into removals. And so I have a book out this week that talks about actually this idea of should we nationalize fossil fuel companies and turn them into removal companies. I think if we link these two things, phase out and carbon removal, it can deal with some of these mitigation, deterrence, moral hazards concerns.
Thank you, Holly. Now we only have 1 minute left, so unfortunately you cannot take any more questions. But just to the panelists, just to leave everybody perhaps on a positive note, in one word, how would you summarize what's next? Natalie, one word?
Oh my God. Too hard. Removal, repair.
Definitely.
2 words, climate restoration.
Excellent. Yes.
2 words, a lot of work. No.
And then, Dan? Oh, you're mute.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I was distracted.
In one word, to live on a positive note. In one word.
One word.
Yes.
Remove it. Well, removals.
Okay, Jesse?
3 words: acknowledge the elephant.
Excellent. And Holly?
I'll go with phase out.
All right. And then Sean, last but not least, any last word?
I'm going to finish where we started, and it is a positive thing. We can repair this climate.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be a recording of this session as well. So thank you.